the macabre history of the Donnelly family. Their farm, where 28 visitors were never accounted for. The Donnelly family arrived in Lucan under gray skies and the kind of silence that never lifted. They came in a worn cart pulled by a mule with glazed-over eyes, its hooves cracked and bleeding from the frozen road. James Donnelly drove without speaking. Beside him sat his wife, Maura, clutching a small wooden box she never let out of sight. Behind them, 4 children stared blankly at the passing trees, their faces pale, unmoved by the cold or the long journey. It was late autumn, and the fields they claimed were already dying. 20 acres of crooked fences, stunted corn, and a barn that leaned to one side like it was trying to flee. They moved in without fanfare, without introduction, without even asking for help. A neighbor saw them hammering thick boards over the windows of the main house, sealing out all light. Someone else claimed the children were seen digging into the frozen earth behind the barn on the first night. But this was a land of superstitions and long winters. People whispered, then forgot. The Donnellys had chosen land no one else wanted. Dirt that grew nothing but twisted roots and yielded a strange metallic smell when wet. That suited them fine. Inside the house, the air never seemed to move. The fireplace was rarely lit and the curtains stayed closed at all hours. James was seen some days walking the fence line, pacing methodically as if measuring something only he could see. He never waved, he never smiled. Maura came to market twice a month, always alone, her lips pressed shut, her hands gloved no matter the season. She carried coins in a cloth sack that clinked with an unsettling irregularity. Metal on bone, someone once said under their breath. She bought meat but never bread, vinegar but never salt, jars but never fruit. When the butcher asked about the children, she only said they were quiet by design. She never haggled, she never laughed. When the schoolhouse sent letters about enrollment, they were returned unopened, sealed with wax stamped in a design the teacher could never quite describe afterward, a shape that twisted even in memory. The children wandered the woods at dusk, barefoot even in snow, never speaking, never playing. They often circled trees in perfect concentric loops, stopping suddenly to press their ears against the bark as if listening for something inside. One child, the youngest, was once seen placing a dead bird on the church steps before vanishing into the tree line. No one ever saw him again. No one asked. It was easier not to. After all, the Donnellys never caused trouble. They paid their taxes, their land stayed clean even if nothing seemed to grow. Their animals made no noise. Their fence never rotted. Their barn door never creaked. They were polite, which in a place like Lucan meant they were safe. But inside the farmhouse, something else stirred. Beneath the floorboards, beneath the stone foundation laid centuries before the town was ever marked on a map, was a root cellar. It was never used for food. That much one could sense just by standing near the back wall of the pantry where the air grew colder than it should have been, even in summer. Sometimes late at night, travelers passing through on foot said they saw candlelight flicker beneath the slats. Others swore they heard humming, not a song, but a single-held tone, low and steady like breath held too long. A few said it sounded like a voice trying to stay buried. They never stopped to check. No one knocked on the Donnelly door. The family had become part of the land like the brittle weeds and frost-bitten wells. And in Lucan, people respected the dead by staying away from what felt too close to it. Years later, a census worker came to the farm to verify a clerical error. Records showed 6 Donnellys living on the property, but the original tax grant listed 9. He knocked once. He waited. No answer came. He walked the perimeter of the home, noting how no prints marked the frost. The curtains hadn't moved. The barn door was locked with a nail driven straight through the wood. And then he noticed the mule still tethered to the rotting post it had arrived with, its bones long stripped clean. No birds circled overhead. No dogs barked in the distance. It was a farm frozen in its own stillness, untouched by time or nature. A farm too quiet. A quiet no living thing could maintain unless something else had replaced the living. The barn stood apart from the house not by distance but by feeling. It was smaller than most, squatting low to the ground with no windows and a slanted tin roof that never rattled, even during storms. The walls had been painted once, years ago, but the color had long since burnt away. Now it was coated in something deeper, a thick, oily black from years of burning oak and sealing smoke into the wood's pores. Locals called it the charcoal barn, though no one ever saw charcoal sold. No one asked about the smell that clung to the soil around it, a sweet, metallic scent that turned bitter in your throat. James Donnelly entered it daily, always alone. He carried nothing in and came out empty-handed, his hands scrubbed raw with ash and lye. His boots were always clean, but his shadow seemed heavier each time he stepped back into daylight, like something clung to him that didn't belong to this world. The sounds started shortly after the second frost, low, rhythmic thudding that came just after sunset. Sometimes it was a dragging scrape, like metal pulled across concrete, even though the barn had no stone floor. Other times it was softer, muffled whimpers too distorted to be animal, too wet to be human breath. At first, neighbors blamed the wind or foxes caught in traps, but as the nights wore on, people began sleeping with lamps lit and windows latched, even though the Donnellys never came to town after dark. A boy from the next farm over once dared to sneak close, crawling beneath the pine fence until he reached the barn's rear wall. He returned silent, vomited twice behind his shed, and refused to speak again until his family moved away 6 weeks later. Before they left, his father told the sheriff the boy had seen a hole in the wood. Not large, but enough to glimpse inside. What he saw wasn't firewood or tools, it was a chair. Iron, bolted to the ground. And ropes, too many ropes for anything still alive. What no one outside the family knew was that the barn had been redesigned from within. The interior walls were double-layered, packed with sodden hay and thick slabs of timber, not for warmth but for sound. At the center was a pit, shallow, square, covered with a hatch. Beneath it, James had hollowed out a space just large enough for movement but never standing. The ground there had been lined with iron shavings and animal grease, not for any scientific reason, but because James believed pain held better in the air when it had something to cling to. He kept journals of each session, though no one would ever read them. They were buried beneath the floor in jars packed with salt and wax, labeled only by date and weight. The weight wasn't of the body, but of the pieces removed. Mora never entered, but she washed the blades in scalding milk and boiled them afterward in vinegar. She claimed it kept rust away, though it never did. The barn was not a place of death. That came later. The barn was for shaping and for stripping voice, name, and memory, until only the raw silence of obedience remained. And once that silence was perfect, only then was it allowed to die. The ledger began with tidy handwriting and a sense of order that bordered on obsession. James Donnelly kept it tucked beneath a floorboard beneath his bed, wrapped in burlap and waxed cloth. It was never intended for money or crops. This was not an account of business, it was a record of passage, a list of the forgotten. Each name was written with care, followed by a date, height, shoe size, and blood type when known. The first page held only 3 entries, spaced months apart. All drifters who had knocked at the Donnelly door asking for warmth, food, or the promise of coin for labor. James had welcomed them without hesitation, guiding them to the barn with the soft voice of a father offering safety. He always waited until their second night before writing anything down. That was his rule. The first night was for study, observing how they walked, if they winced when kneeling, and whether they looked away when hands were raised near them. The second night was for truth. That was when he brought out the question book. The question book was never written in. It was spoken aloud, memorized from childhood and passed from a father he never named to a son he would never claim. It began with simple things. Do you believe pain teaches? Do you think the soul can be unknotted? But it always ended the same. Would you rather disappear or become something worthy of fear? Few ever answered. Those who did were buried deeper. By the time the third winter came, the ledger had grown thick. Page after page, initials bled into numbers, patterns forming only in hindsight. Most entries were young men, transient, rootless, their details unnervingly precise. One was marked only as stranger with the silver cross. Another, sang in sleep. Remove the tongue first. He never recorded deaths. He never had to. The act of writing was enough. Once the name was on paper, they ceased to exist. The local constable came once after a family inquired about their missing son. He had been headed west, but stopped for supplies in Lucan. Witnesses placed him at the general store, chatting with James Donnelly over burlap sacks and match tins. The constable found nothing on the farm. James smiled, invited him in, and handed him a cup of broth so bitter it numbed the tongue. The constable left an hour later and resigned 2 weeks after that, citing a sickness that never got diagnosed. When new travelers arrived, James didn't rush. He let them settle into the illusion. Food, warmth, a corner in the shed, even a morning chore. He asked about their pasts, offered pipe tobacco, and made them feel seen. But by the time they noticed they hadn't seen the sky in 2 days or heard their own names spoken aloud, they had already been written down. By the 28th entry, the ledger was no longer just a list. It was a record of silence, names removed from the world without noise, without trace. Each one fed into something deeper than ritual. It became his scripture. In James Donnelly's twisted belief, the ledger was not evidence of cruelty. It was evidence of discipline. And he believed that discipline was the only thing separating man from rot. Maura Donnelly was not a woman people feared, at least not openly. She was small and soft-voiced and always wore a bonnet, even indoors, the string pulled tight enough to leave faint red lines across her cheeks. Her hands, though weathered, moved with care, folding linens, slicing apples, scrubbing the same plank floor until the grain was pale as bone. If James was the presence that cast a shadow over the farm, Maura was the shape that dissolved into it, drifting soundlessly from chore to chore, always a step behind, always watching. It was her preserves that first warmed her to the town. She began selling them at the Lucan market after their second year on the land. Glass jars of rich red fruit layered with thick syrup, sealed tight with wax and cotton string. They sold quickly and were praised for their texture and their strange depth of flavor. Some said they reminded them of something old, something they couldn't name but missed. The sweetness lingered on the tongue just a little longer than it should have, and people returned for more even when the price rose. She never spoke much, only nodded and sometimes smiled without showing teeth. She offered no ingredients, no recipe, only jars. Always red, always fresh. Rumors drifted like they always did in small towns, but they were thin, almost embarrassed of themselves. A woman whispered that her husband had taken sick after eating too much of the preserve straight from the jar, teeth stained, lips swollen. A child claimed to find something hard and white in their spoon. A splinter, or maybe a seed, but too smooth for either. Still, no one stopped buying. Rarity excused all discomfort. One man called it a taste that feels like it shouldn't be allowed, and kept eating. It wasn't until the doctor's apprentice, a young man named Ellis, bought a jar for his mother that the questions took shape. His mother never ate it. She said it reminded her of boiled pennies and spoiled milk. Curious, Ellis brought the jar to his teacher, who had been trained in the old ways when poisons were weighed in grains and blood was tested with fire. What they found inside the jar would never be published, never written into any medical report. The iron content was nearly 20 times what a person could safely consume. The sugars had been blended with something darker, ground bone ash most likely, and a thickening agent that mimicked fruit fiber but resisted decay. A fine-toothed pick through the preserves revealed hair too short to be animal, and a fragment of what the doctor swore was tooth enamel. He sealed the jar and buried it behind his house, warning Ellis never to speak of it again. The town wouldn't believe it, he said. They never do. They'll protect their comforts even if it kills them. Maura continued selling for another season. Her customer base never dwindled. She had perfected something the others hadn't, a product that created longing. It didn't matter what it contained, only how it made them feel. Heavy, satisfied, almost forgetful. No one ever tied the preserves to the missing travelers. No one connected the dates on the jars to the entries James wrote in secret. Maura never entered the barn, but she accepted what came from it. She boiled it down, stirred in spices, and thickened the horror until it gleamed under glass. It wasn't murder to her. It was a transformation. Raw fear turned into sweetness, loss turned into warmth. She believed she was preserving more than food. She was preserving silence. And the town, spoon after spoon, was happy to help. They arrived just after the first thaw, when the snowbanks melted into slush and the ditches swelled with gray water. 2 children dressed alike in clothes too clean for the season, their faces too pale for farmland life. No wagon had brought them, no carriage had dropped them off. They simply appeared at the schoolhouse one morning, standing side by side in silence, waiting for the teacher to notice. A note pinned to the girl's collar, signed in block lettering. Their names are Elias and Ruth. They belong to us now. The Donnelly farm wasn't named, but everyone knew. The teacher, Miss Elwood, tried asking questions. The twins answered none. They didn't smile, didn't shift in discomfort, and didn't blink too often. What unsettled her most wasn't the stillness of their mouths, but the stillness of their eyes. Deep black, not from color but from dilation, as if their pupils had grown to drown everything else. Elias stared without focus. Ruth watched without mercy. They joined lessons without hesitation, but never raised hands, never scribbled notes. When told to recite numbers, they spoke in perfect unison, their voices hollow and flat, like echoes from a cave too deep to find the end. At recess, they didn't play. They walked laps around the schoolyard in opposing directions, eyes locked, never once touching, never once speaking. When a boy tried to trip Elias, Ruth grabbed the boy's wrist and squeezed until he dropped to his knees. She said nothing. Elias never flinched. The bruising took 3 weeks to fade. Miss Elwood wrote to the Donnellys for a meeting. No one came. The twins returned the next morning as if nothing had happened. Stranger things emerged over time. The children never shivered in the cold. They never coughed or scratched mosquito bites. When Ruth fell on a nail, the wood puncturing her leg clean through, she stood up calmly and walked to her desk, leaving a perfect trail of blood that she seemed not to notice. The wound never became infected. When Miss Elwood finally asked her why she didn't cry, Ruth said flatly that their father had taught them stillness. That pain was the language of the unworthy, and they were learning silence. When pressed further, she said nothing. Neither of them ever spoke again that week. The doctor came once to inspect them, but left after only a few minutes, pale and shaking. He resigned the following day. He never returned to medicine. Whispers followed them. Some said the children weren't really siblings. Others swore they'd seen different children before them. two others who looked similar but not the same years ago and then gone. The thought settled like a sickness. No birth records, no church names, no graves. Just Elias and Ruth unchanging. When asked where they came from, they both answered the same. We were made quiet and then we were brought here. They spoke as if it were scripture. Eventually the town stopped asking. Miss Elwood marked them as presents each day but never made eye contact again. When they disappeared the following year without notice or farewell, no one searched. No one mentioned it out loud. It was understood somehow that whatever they had been was not meant to stay. And somewhere on that cold stretch of Donnelly land, the silence they'd mastered continued to grow. The pit had no smell. That was the first thing the boy noticed. He had run 2 miles barefoot through thorns and frostbite just to get away from the Donnelly farm, his breath catching in his throat from more than the cold. The smokehouse had always seemed dead quiet, but that day something had cracked near its edge. A shift in the earth. A soft caving sound, like a mouth opening too slow to scream. Behind it, sunken beneath a patch of scrub and moss, he found the trench. 6 feet across, maybe 10 long, dug straight into the limestone shelf. At first he thought it was an old animal trough or dry well. But the walls weren't natural. They'd been carved by hand, smoothed, angled, and coated in a layer of white dust so fine it clung to his eyelids. He leaned in. Beneath the powder was bone. Some were large, rib cages, femurs, hollowed skulls, animals maybe, but wrong in their arrangement. They had been laid out in mirrored patterns, spirals that twisted inward, all of them stripped clean, polished like stone, their marrow hollowed as if drained. He climbed in without thinking, barefoot and shivering. His heel struck something round, and when he bent to uncover it, his fingers trembled not from fear but from what they told him. It wasn't an animal jaw, not with that many teeth, and it had no snout. Just a clean arc of bone, too flat, too human. The boy stepped back, and his foot broke through a crusted layer beneath the ash. He fell halfway through, landing on a mass of ribs too uniform to be wild. There were no clothes, no tools, no tags, just bones layered deep beneath the others, each one dulled by time but still arranged. The pit hadn't been used for hiding. It had been used for cleansing. He scrambled out, his arms coated in white powder, mouth dry, unsure if it was fear or something else climbing up his throat. He ran toward town, leaving the forest behind him. He said nothing when he arrived, only collapsed on the porch of the baker's house, shaking, eyes wide open, unable to blink. They say he left to fetch the sheriff the next morning. He never made it. No horses reported him on the road. No one remembered seeing him board the ferry. By nightfall, the Donnellys were already back at market, Maura selling her jars, James loading sacks of flour with clean hands. When a local man walked past the smokehouse the next week, he noticed new soil packed tight behind it. No more sunken earth, no broken crust. Just flat ground and a single iron hook hammered into a tree above it, swaying gently without wind. Later, when a drifter went missing, some said he'd been last seen near that tree. But by then the town had already learnt to look away. The bleaching pit became one more silence on the land, its purpose erased not by time but by choice. The boy's name was never spoken again. And in that empty trench, cleaned of its truth, something waited, a ritual half finished but never paused. It began as a whisper, like most things in Lucan did. A flicker was seen across the trees near midnight, a faint orange glow weaving in and out of the branches, slow and even like breath. The Donnellys walked into the woods together every full moon, never missing one, no matter the season. James led with Maura behind and the children in a silent line, each holding a black lantern shaped like none had seen before. They weren't made of glass, but thick cast iron with slits, not panes. The light barely escaped, only slicing sideways into the trees like blades through fog. From a distance, it almost looked like they were carrying nothing, only shadows moving across the land without sound. Some claimed they saw the lights from their fields. Others swore the forest pulsed when the family entered it, like the land itself remembered them, but no one followed. Because the Donnellys had lived in town for years by then, and people had learnt that whatever the family did in private was better left untouched. The children never spoke about the walks, not that they ever spoke much at all. Ruth and Elias would sometimes return the next morning with dirt beneath their nails or bits of bark in their hair, but their expressions never changed. School teachers eventually stopped asking. Even when Ruth once fell asleep in class and muttered the word coalskin, no one pressed her to explain. The word stuck in the air like smoke, but no one wrote it down. It wasn't until the widow Sims lost her only son that the stories began to sharpen. He had been 17, clever and restless, and talked often of exposing the Donnellys as frauds or worse. The last anyone saw of him, he was walking toward the woods on the night of a full moon, his face smug, shoulders squared like someone ready to catch a lie. He was never seen again. Days passed, then weeks. Search parties turned up nothing. And then, while cleaning his room, the widow found something scorched into the wood beneath his mattress. Marks burnt into the floor in a spiral pattern, a shape too clean to be accidental, too old to be recognized. The burns had been made deliberately, not with fire but with heat from below, as if the wood itself had bled from the inside out. The sheriff visited the Donnellys but came back saying nothing could be proven. They had no idea where the boy had gone, James claimed. They expressed sorrow. Maura even brought preserves to the widow the next day and left them on the porch without knocking. But the widow knew. She began to scream at night, loud enough that neighbors reported it, not out of concern but fear. Her son's name was never spoken again by anyone but her, and even she started calling him the last one, as if he were a tally, not a child. The spiral mark appeared again weeks later, this time on the shed of a farmer who'd once turned James Donnelly away from a land sale. The same ash-coiled brand, the same absence of flame. The man moved out by spring. It became clear to those willing to admit it, the lantern walks weren't for mourning or prayer. They were for keeping count. The ritual was not a performance but a requirement. Each light wasn't a beacon but a gate. James believed the land had memory and the forest was its mouth. The lanterns didn't guide the way, they sealed it behind them. And whatever was waiting in those woods, it was no longer asleep. It had been fed, taught, and shaped by hands that claimed they were only doing what was necessary. People stopped looking out their windows on full moons. Some boarded them shut, because the forest no longer hid the Donnellys. It carried them. And once the lights vanished into the trees, the silence that followed felt too heavy to disturb. The house had long been abandoned by the time the demolition crew arrived. Its bones were crooked, warped by years of frost and silence. The walls had buckled in places and the porch caved under its own weight. But the attic remained oddly intact, sealed shut, untouched by water or light. They only found the hidden chamber by accident when a worker stepped through a rotted beam and fell into the hollow above the ceiling. What he landed in wasn't storage or dust. It was a room, small, perfectly square. No windows, no insulation except for a dense layer of stitched wool covering every inch of wall, floor, and ceiling. Thick, dark, matted with age. At first glance, it looked like a failed attempt at warmth. But when they noticed the copper piping coiled like veins beneath the wool and leading down through the walls toward what had once been a coal-burning furnace, they understood it wasn't designed to keep heat in. It was built to take air out. There was no furniture, no personal items, only the faint outline of something circular in the floor. a discoloration where sweat and skin may have rested too long. The wool had been nailed down at the corners with small, flat tacks. When peeled back, the boards beneath were scorched black, not from flame but from pressure, as though something had pressed into them over hours, maybe days, leaving an oily imprint too old to lift. The copper pipes ran along the corners of the ceiling, then dropped low, ending in small valves with slotted openings no wider than a coin. When tested, they showed signs of sulfur residue and carbon saturation. The room had not been ventilated. It had been vacuumed. Slowly, deliberately, over time. What unsettled the crew most was the door, thick oak with a latching mechanism on the outside only, but no visible handle on the inside, not even a groove, just a wall. The room was soundproofed with wool, sealed from light and drained of breath. Whatever was placed there had no choice but to wait. A man from town identified the materials and confirmed what others had already feared. It wasn't for storage, it wasn't for safety. It was a chamber for testing how long the human body could remain aware while air thinned. It wasn't about suffocation. That would be too fast. It was about stripping breath molecule by molecule, forcing the lungs to bargain with the body. And the mind, deprived but not unconscious, would start to fold inward, thoughts collapsing in on themselves like paper burnt from the center. James Donnelly had once written in a journal that the soul revealed itself when silence filled every inch of the body. That obedience came not from force, but from stillness. And that stillness only arrived when the body could no longer scream. They never found remains. Only a faint handprint on the inside of the door pressed into wool smeared downward, not clawed, not frantic, just deliberate. As if the one inside had finally accepted what the room was built for, to listen, to quiet, to end. The well had been dry for generations. Its stone walls were cracked and overgrown with ivy, and the old rope pulley was rusted stiff. Children dared each other to drop stones down it, but no sound ever returned. When the land was cleared for redevelopment a century later, workers lowered a camera into the shaft, expecting debris, maybe old tools or wildlife nests. What they found stopped the project for weeks. At the base, tangled in silt and broken brick, were dozens of thin wires, hand-twisted copper, brittle with age. Strung along them were teeth, tiny, milk-white, unmistakably human, not scattered, not loose, arranged. Each tooth was carefully drilled at the root and threaded onto the wire like beads. Some wires ended in hooks, bent at cruel angles, rusted but still sharp. The hooks had been weighted with stones carved into blunt shapes, as if once used to stretch or anchor. What they pulled from the well wasn't just a collection. It was a design. Investigators, unsure where to begin, searched nearby soil and found a metal box sealed with wax. Inside were brittle papers, curled and blackened at the edges. The handwriting was jagged but controlled. No names, no dates, only headings. Phase 1, isolation response. Phase 2, cranial reaction to absence of maternal voice. Phase 3, interruption of sleep by sudden nerve shock. Beneath each were pages of tightly written notes, some medical, others philosophical. One line was underlined twice. Pain received before memory becomes part of the body's language. The paper had been scorched, not by accident but by intent, as if the author had wanted to preserve it just long enough to be found but not traced. There were diagrams of infant skulls, crude yet precise, with entry points marked at the temples, jaw hinges, and behind the ears. Measurements noted the spacing between nerve clusters. In one passage, a note read, "Distress as a tool of shaping. Fear before speech encourages compliance without comprehension." Another stated, "Teeth removed at intervals to mark developmental stages. hooks introduced to gauge resistance patterns. The teeth had no names attached to them. There were too many to guess how many children had been involved. But all of them were from early infancy. Soft enamel, rounded edges. Some had blood staining still preserved in the cracks of the wire, long dried into a dark rust color. The hooks had been designed to lodge into flesh but not tear. They were meant to stay, to hold, to weigh down small bodies during periods of observation. Whatever had been done was not brief. It was a study. Years in the making, carried out under silence and justification. The Donnelly farm had no records of births, no graves for infants, and no children officially listed beyond the twins. But someone sometime had made it a place where soundless pain was not only administered, but also recorded, measured, and refined. The well had not hidden the horror. It had stored it like a ledger written in teeth and metal. And what it revealed was that the evil on that land had not only believed in suffering, it had believed in understanding it, perfecting it, and handing it down. The house had sagged for decades before anyone dared tear it down. By the time the land was sold, the walls were bowed inward, the floor split through with frost, and the roof curled like paper left in heat too long. The demolition crew didn't ask questions. Most were young and unfamiliar with the name Donnelly, and those who did remember the stories kept them quiet. It was just another condemned structure in a forgotten patch of Ontario. But the moment the first support beam was cut, the ground exhaled a smell that didn't belong to soil or time, dry, burnt, and bitter. They paused the job, thinking maybe there'd been a fire once, something long ago buried. But as the floorboards were pried up and the base of the house exposed, what they found was far stranger. The foundation wasn't laid with limestone nor brick. It was packed tight with a dense gray powder, fine as flour, layered thick beneath each beam, sealed with a tar-like mixture and crushed fragments of bone. At first they assumed animal remains, but one of the workers had trained in forensic cleanup. He recognized the density, the shape of a curved jawline barely intact, and the subtle ridges of a human vertebra ground into shards. Tests confirmed what instinct had already whispered. The ash wasn't from firewood, and the calcium traces were too high for livestock. This had been human, many humans. Sifted, processed, and packed deliberately. The beams hadn't just rested on them, they had been secured by them, mortared with death. In places, the ash had been mixed with lime to bind the weight, creating a hard surface beneath certain load-bearing walls. Each corner of the house had slightly different compositions, as if someone had measured the materials by weight, ensuring balance not through engineering but through bone. Investigators found a buried box not far from the south corner, wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed with wax. Inside were notes, not journals this time, instructions. Detailed entries on how different bones burnt, which yielded more ash, which clogged the chimney less. There were records of weather conditions, of drying times, of when a body should be stripped versus when it should be burnt whole. One line read, "Ribs crumble better after 3 days exposed to frost. Femurs need the furnace." Another, "The jawbone, if cracked properly, leaves no tooth trace." The handwriting matched earlier entries from the ledger. James Donnelly had not only killed, he had measured the weight of a human life by how well it could support a structure. The house wasn't built on death. It was built with it. The true number could never be confirmed. The ash had been compacted, diluted, and moved over time. But by rough count, at least 24 bodies had been rendered, processed, and used to hold up the Donnelly home. Not buried, not hidden, used. Each step taken through that house had pressed down on what remained of the vanished, their silence compacted into the very walls that kept the wind out. When the crew left for the day, they didn't return. The house was never fully torn down. It collapsed weeks later during a storm, not with a roar, but with a slow, exhausted sigh, as if the weight it had carried for so long had finally decided to let go. The confession was found by accident, hidden behind a loose panel in the wall of St. Mary's Chapel, a church that hadn't held service in decades. The wood had warped from years of damp, and when the new caretaker removed the panel to check for rot, a sealed envelope slid out from behind the plaster. It was wrapped in waxed linen, bound in twine, and marked only with one word: forgive. Inside was a stack of pages, yellowed and cracking at the edges, the ink faded but still legible. The handwriting was precise and measured, with long, slanted strokes and a rigid rhythm, the kind that comes from someone trained to stay steady under pressure. The pages began not with apology but with explanation. "I write this in my final year, not from guilt but from obligation," it read. "We were taught that silence was sacred, but the silence has grown too loud. It's time someone understood what was done, and why." The writer identified herself only as Ruth, daughter of no one, raised by James Donnelly in the practice of ordered pain. She was one of the twins, presumed long dead or vanished. But the letter revealed she had lived quietly nearby for decades under a different name. Her voice on the page was calm, emotionless, and almost instructional. She described their childhood not as abuse but as training. Stillness was rewarded, flinching punished. The first lesson had been to hold a burning spoon against the inside of the arm without moving. The second had been to sit blindfolded for hours while Maura whispered contradictions about love and punishment in the dark. By the time they were 7, they were helping in the barn, not to kill, but to document. Ruth wrote that James believed every person carried the imprint of sin in their nerves, and that pain, applied properly, could bring it to the surface. He didn't see himself as a murderer. He saw himself as a purifier. Each subject was tested, each one was recorded. Rituals were built around failure, not to summon demons, not to serve gods, but to expose what he believed was the rotting center of every human soul. Ruth's role, she wrote, was to observe and catalog the threshold moments. The second someone broke, confessed a lie, or begged for forgiveness that hadn't been asked for. These were signs to James that the soul had begun to surface. He believed they could be reshaped after that, or if too corrupted, harvested. That word was used often in the confession, harvested. The teeth, the bones, the ashes, none were discarded. They were repurposed, ritually folded back into the structures they lived in. The body was the failure, James claimed. The material had to be reminded of its place. Ruth described in chilling detail the role of the breathless chamber, the purpose of the copper pipes, and the way air was removed so slowly the brain remained aware of every second of its own suffocation. She claimed the screaming was not what marked failure. It was the silence that followed, the moment the body stopped trying to resist and simply accepted its unraveling. That was when the soul, in his eyes, could be judged. Toward the end of the confession, Ruth described a final ritual, one never completed. A child unnamed who resisted too long, whose silence remained intact even under months of isolation and testing. She believed this child had been the catalyst for the end. James had become unstable and paranoid. He believed the child was pure and therefore dangerous. Proof that pain could be resisted, that the soul might not be as easily controlled as he'd built his life around. Ruth admitted to helping the child escape. She never confirmed if he survived, only that she left the gate open one night and found the barn door swinging the next morning empty. James, she wrote, never recovered from the loss. He tore down his own notes, burnt what he could, and became increasingly erratic, attempting to restart the rituals with no foundation. That's when the real unraveling began, not just of the family, but of the belief system itself. Ruth ended the confession with one sentence written in a different hand, shakier, almost reluctant. He taught us that silence is the truth, but I have learnt that silence is rot. She left no address, no signature beyond her name, just the document hidden in the bones of the church. By the time the letter was found, she was already gone, and what remained was not a record of repentance, but a manual, cold, precise, and deeply unrepentant, for how evil, when dressed as order, becomes its own form of religion. The forensic teams arrived with quiet reluctance, not because they doubted the claims, but because of what the land had already whispered. The Donnelly farm had been marked for decades as a place to avoid, the kind of soil that made boots feel heavier the longer you stood on it. But now, with the journal fragments, the tooth wires, the chamber in the attic, and the sealed confession found in the church, the pressure could no longer be ignored. Official permission was granted. Excavation began. It wasn't long before they hit the first one. A length of cloth packed tight with earth, wrapped around bones arranged not for concealment but for permanence. The body had been buried vertically, head up, arms at its sides facing east. It wasn't a grave, it was a placement. A mark, as if someone had planted it rather than laid it to rest. Over the next 6 weeks, 27 more were found, each one following the same configuration, spaced carefully apart, not touching, not overlapping, their skulls clean of trauma, their jaws gently pried open. Each had been positioned in direct opposition to traditional burial rites. Heads up instead of down, faces exposed to the rising sun, as if forced to look toward something they were never meant to meet. There were no coffins, no markings, and no remnants of personal items. Only bone, ash, and the occasional trace of iron or copper in the soil around the spine. What struck investigators most was the consistency. This hadn't been improvised. It had been planned and carried out with method and ritual. A map of belief written in the dead. The ages varied, some barely teenagers, others old enough to have traveled far before ending up here. But there was no pattern in gender, no obvious choice in background. They had simply been taken, documented, measured, buried. The count matched the ledger exactly, 28. And yet not a single one could be identified by name. The records were missing, the memories erased, and the evidence too decayed to link to any one missing person's case. It was as if the victims had been scrubbed from history not just physically, but spiritually, unremembered by design. Local law enforcement issued a statement confirming the discovery but claimed there was no one left to prosecute. James Donnelly had long since died, and with him, whatever twisted theology had driven the family. Ruth, whose confession had surfaced too late, was believed to have taken her own life shortly after writing it, though no body was ever found. The church refused to acknowledge the letter's contents. The townspeople, faced with undeniable proof, returned to their homes and bolted their doors. No one wanted a trial. No one wanted to speak the names that had been stolen. Instead, the bones were cataloged, boxed, and quietly stored in a government facility marked Unidentified Remains, case number 1842. No burial was held, no memorial erected. There was talk of placing a plaque, but it was delayed indefinitely. The land where the farmhouse once stood was eventually fenced off and labeled as protected ground, not for conservation but for containment. Some said they still heard sounds at night. Soft shuffling, the creak of rope, the quiet clink of wire brushing against teeth. Most dismissed it as superstition, but even the skeptics never stayed past dusk. The soil had memories, and what had been buried there had not forgotten. It wasn't just evidence they uncovered. It was a ritual. a design meant not to hide evil but to preserve it in silence. And when the final body was lifted from the ground, its face turned skyward, its mouth still open to something only it could see. The workers understood that the Donnelly farm had never been a place of death. It had been a cathedral built beneath the surface, a sanctuary for something too cruel to name. And no one, not even the dead feuds, had ever truly left. They stopped calling it the Donnelly farm. Over time, the name itself thinned out, avoided in conversation like something toxic in the mouth. Locals began referring to it only by direction, out east of the wood line or past the fence that doesn't rot. It became more rumor than record, a place parents warned children away from without explaining why. The house had collapsed, the barn swallowed by time, but the ground remained untouched. No one dared plant there, though the soil grew thick with wild thistle, black-rooted and sharp-tipped, as if the earth itself remembered what it had been asked to hold. Even animals kept clear. Deer broke their path to avoid it. Birds crossed the sky in wide arcs. At night, strange fog crawled up from the roots even in the dry months, low, silent, and dense enough to muffle your own breath. People stopped looking directly at it. They said that land listened. The discovery of the 28 vertical burials sent a quiet shock through the province, not because people hadn't believed the stories, but because some had. And that belief, dismissed, mocked, ignored for years, had now become evidence. Real, unarguable, and buried in plain sight. The government responded slowly, cautiously, as if afraid to disturb something older than law. A new regulation passed within months. All rural land transfers would now require forensic soil testing, especially in areas flagged with unsolved disappearances. It was the first time land in Ontario was legally recognized as a potential witness. Quietly, a task force was formed to investigate similar disappearances tied to isolated properties. Several files reopened, most closed again without answer. Whatever the Donnellys had done, they had done thoroughly. Their victims stripped of identity, folded into foundations, scattered across ritual and silence so completely that nothing remained to trace. Only ash, wire, and scars in the earth where names should have been. The memorial came not from the government, but from the families. Those who had long suspected, long waited, and now finally knew. It stood at the edge of the property, beyond the trees, but just close enough to see the rise of the land that had once held the house. A black stone slab, unpolished, left rough around the edges. No statue, no flowers. Just a plaque with 28 etched names, and beneath them one line: taken without face. Remembered without rest. It was the first time some of those names had ever been spoken aloud in public. A few visitors left tokens. Buttons, baby teeth in glass jars, twine knots or feathers. Offerings not to spirits, but to the silence itself. The local paper published one article and never followed up. The town stopped holding harvest festivals. The church remained empty. Yet something lingered. The ritual, though broken, had left its outline behind. Investigators described the Donnelly method as a belief system, not madness, but a doctrine too structured to dismiss, a theology of pain, a science of erasure. And that unsettled more than the killings ever did. Because it had worked. The family had operated undisturbed for years, not because they hid well, but because they smiled when they bought sugar, tipped the butcher, and never raised their voices. They had been allowed, welcome, protected by the same politeness that kept people from asking where the children went. And now, in whispers, some began to ask whether the Donnellys were an anomaly, or just the ones who left behind evidence. The land remains fenced off, never sold. No future plans are filed for it. Occasionally, someone new to the area asks what happened there. They're usually told, "It's just old ground. best left alone. But the memorial still stands, and sometimes when dusk falls quiet enough, the fog rises from the roots and the air begins to weigh heavier. Those names seem to echo without sound, not calling for justice, not even for truth. Just for remembrance, just to not be buried again.